Hi, everyone. This is Intro to Africa at Flagler College. I'm Dr. Young. We've been talking about um, the sort of politics of the medieval era in Africa. In the last lecture, we um, spent some time with Ethiopia. We also talked about the major empires that grew up and flourished in West Africa, especially in the Sahel region. And so in this one, we want to move a bit to the south and talk about the rainforest region of West Africa. I would have probably done this in the last lecture, but it was running long, and so I decided to break it up this way. Things are a little different in the rainforest than they are in the Sahel. The rainforest resisted the creation of large empires, not the forest itself, but just the environment makes it more difficult to sort of string together all of these kafus into a large empire. The physical barriers are more imposing. And this same period in the rainforest also continues the trend of pioneering villages, people moving on a fairly frequent basis, though becoming more and more stable over time. And the phenomenon of the big man, which we talked about in the last lecture, where these pioneering villages were dominated by usually individual male figures who exerted hegemony. Who they were the ones who created the networks with the incentives to keep people in the same place, and so that's what we tend to see here. Some of these pioneering villages end up uniting with other villages to form a kafu, although the word kafu I think is more applicable to the lands to the north. They'd be speaking different languages here, but similar kind of structure. The 9 villages of Umawofia, for instance, are an example of one of these kind of micro states, or in that case, I think more of a non-hegemonic state, than anything approaching one of these empires of the Sahel region. And so this area tends to produce microstates. That is, they have all of the characteristics of the larger entity. It's just on a smaller scale, as well as some non-hegemonic villages where power is more diffuse, right? So these microstates tend to be dominated by these big men, who again are the ones who wield power by creating the incentives to keep people in the same place. Hopefully I'm not being too redundant with that. Hopefully you've gotten the message by this point that concept of creating incentives, of exerting power over people, is really key to understanding the politics of Africa. Now, these people engaged in agriculture. In the rainforest, this would have meant mostly vine crops. The African yam is important here. You should not confuse the African yam with the slightly sweet vegetable looking substance that you might find on your Thanksgiving table, possibly adorned with brown sugar and marshmallows. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, then trust me, it is a phenomenon in places in the United States and perhaps elsewhere too. The African yam is a tuber, kind of root vegetable. There's a vine that grows up out of the ground, and the yam is underneath it. And these things are really big. They can get up to like 5 or 6 feet long, and they are prepared in a variety of ways. The most common probably is to pound it or sort of mash it into a porridge-like substance, which would then be eaten with a soup, or possibly with some meat or fish or something like that. And so the agriculture was important, and this is previous to the Columbian Exchange, and so the crops that will eventually become important all over Africa, like the New World crops of maize or corn, and cassava and some of these other things, have not yet reached Africa, and so they're still mostly farming these vine crops like yams. Two microstates of note. Ife, which has its beginnings probably around the 12th century, persisting for about 3 centuries. The most significant thing about Ife is their incredible bronze sculptures. The image on the left here is an Ife bronze. This is truly one of the great artistic designs, I think, in the art historical world, in all of world art history. The kind of details and really the nuances of these bronze heads are nothing short of remarkable, and really without any kind of equal anywhere else in the world. And there are, unfortunately, only a handful of these things that have survived from this period, maybe a few dozen of these, some in museums, some held in private collections in different parts of the world. But these Ife bronzes are really, really remarkable. And so in other words, Ife had figured out how to make bronzes or brass, an alloy of copper and other metals, and to sculpt with it, and probably also to make some tools out of it. Another one is Benin, and we talked about Benin a couple of slides ago in the last lecture. Benin was a walled city, one of these concentric ring settlements, and remained prominent for some time. It's probably its greatest heyday was back in the 15th and 16th century, though. And some of the knowledge of Ife about working in bronze or brass made it to Benin, though they were not able to capture the delicacy of the Ife bronzes. But the one on the right is a Benin bronze, a relief sculpture here in bronze, and also fairly unique. And the style is not imitated necessarily anywhere else. So these microstates tend to be these walled capitals that we talked about, and there are a number of these in the West African forest. But there's fairly stable societies, but they did not necessarily exercise hegemony over large territories, just the immediate region, and had markets and other things that. And title systems and rituals and kinship systems and all of these things that create incentives for people to remain there, right? These rainforest societies, and we're talking both about the microstates and about the sort of more diffuse non-hegemonic entities. And this, by the way, does not just apply to West Africa. This also goes down the western coast of Africa into the Congo rainforest. But a few features there. Title-taking societies make an impact there. They're found all over the place. And we'll read about one of these again in Things Fall Apart. But the system of titles, honors that are granted to men who accomplish important things, usually that have to do with fighting wars or hunting or potentially contributing in other ways to the society, are really important. This is how status is determined. It's also a way of again incentivizing people to participate in the society and not to take their tools and their seeds and go somewhere else. A couple of examples of kind of microstates further to the south in the Congo basin rainforest. Cuba, which is a bit further inland, and then Congo, which is right on the coast. Congo is one that we know quite a bit about because the Portuguese in the 15th and 16th centuries established contact with the Kingdom of Congo, as it's called, and convert many of the people there to Christianity. There are some interesting sort of moments. When I teach my upper division course on pre-modern African history, one of the monographs that I have students read is about the implementation of Christianity in the Congo, which is also sort of synchronous with the meaning happening around the same time as the advent of the slave trade. And there is a woman there who is nominally Christian, although this is definitely a syncretic form of the Christian religion with lots of things retained from the indigenous traditions. But she takes on the, her name is Dona Beatriz. It's a Portuguese name. There is a sort of native African name as well. But she claimed to be the reincarnated form of Saint Anthony, the great ancient Christian saint. And she proclaimed that essentially that the Congolese were God's favorite people, that they needed to drive out the Portuguese. She tried to inspire the king, the Mbaza Congo, as he was called, Mbanza Congo, sorry, I pronounced that wrong, to resist the Portuguese, to kind of kick them out and stop them from exercising the privileges they were exercising in the society. And this ultimately led to a war and to the destruction of much of the Kingdom of the Congo, at least for a time. And so some really volatile things happening, and this is in the kind of the late 16th century. So some volatile things happening with the beginnings of European activity on the continent there, but still largely determined by native agency. I want to, and this will be a pattern for much of the rest of the course, actually. We'll talk about politics, and then we will also talk about the economics, so some political and social history, and then some economic history, and all the way through the modern period. We'll do that. But let's consider some of the context for the economy or for trade in West Africa. First of all, most of this region lies within the tsetse fly area, which means that at least the areas in and around the forest, it's only really in the Sahel region that people can use horses and camels and other large animals that don't get African sleeping sickness because there are no tsetse flies there. If you penetrate that rainforest at all, that is the major threat, right? And it's a threat, again, to human beings too, but it's especially a threat to large animals. And so, when the Europeans began to establish contact with people in Africa, one of the things that they noticed, and which they sort of derided as like, how primitive can you be, is that the African societies did not have wheel technology. I mean, as if the wheel is like the one mark of development that has to come first in any society. Well, if you think about it, and think carefully about it, you would be forced to remark or recognize that a prerequisite for wheel technology would be an actual use of the wheel. And the main use of the wheel, of course, is transportation over long distances. But in order to, for the wheel to be effective, it has to be attached to something, a larger load than a human can carry. And thus it must be pulled by a large animal. Well, this whole region of West Africa, and down even into the Congo rainforest region too, it doesn't have any large animals. And so of course they didn't have wheel technology. They had absolutely no use for wheel technology. They didn't have roads per se. They had paths through the forest. Of course, up in the Sahel region, in the savannah, they did have roads. They transported things via the river and then, loaded them onto camel caravans or onto horses and transported them over longer distances, but they could not do this in the rainforest or anywhere there was the tsetse fly. And so if, any sort of trade had to be carried out by human porters. They were the only option really for carrying goods from one place to another. Hence, trade did not tend to happen over long distances because humans don't necessarily want to carry loads. It's not practical to do that over long distances. You can't carry enough really to make it worth your while if you're taking things over a long distance by essentially by human porter, right? And so trade tended to be localized as a result of this. Now that doesn't mean that they weren't tied into larger networks. We have already remarked, but let me underscore this very important point, that the West African areas south of the Sahel, sub-Saharan West Africa, had commodities like gold and salt and some copper, by the way, as well as slaves. And I keep sort of dancing around the question of slaves. Trust me, we will have plenty to say about this very soon in the course. But these things are in demand all over the place, and so it made sense for them to procure these things which could be carried. I mean, a small amount of gold has a very high value. Same thing for copper, and even for salt. It's worth carrying a heavy quantity of salt via human porter over a fairly long distance because you're going to get a good price for it. It's going to be beneficial ultimately. And so we have this kind of symbiotic relationship between the desert caravaneers, mostly Berbers who had mastered the trade routes, the oases, and the lore that it took to cross the Sahara Desert, and the forest merchants, with people in the cities along the Niger River, like Timbuktu and Djenné and Gao, and eventually the kingdoms like Ashanti and Segu, but that's more into the 18th and 19th centuries, acting as middlemen, right? And so obtaining their goods from the merchants in the forest who transported things via human porter to these larger towns, these major economic centers, and that's where the caravaneers would meet up with their contacts there and would buy the gold and the copper and the salt, and the slaves who were, the thing about slaves is they can transport themselves, right? So that's that solves the problem of the human porter, or the lack of draft animal issue. And so these commodities were taken by the caravaneers, marched across the desert, and sold in points north of the Sahara, mostly in the port cities along the Mediterranean, over into Egypt, and even over into the Arabian Peninsula. Crafts were really important, but also played a kind of mixed social and complicated social role in these West African societies. They were localized. Each place had its own particular styles of crafts. Again, we could go back to the last slide and look at these bronzes, right? These are crafts and fairly localized. Only in Ife were these bronze heads produced. Only in Benin were the relief bronzes produced, right? And so each locale had its own style of goods that it made. And by far the most important, well, maybe I shouldn't say by far the most important, definitely one of great importance was metalworking, especially working in iron, right? Because iron is the most effective metal for making tools. The thing about iron smelting is that it's difficult, right? It requires tremendously high temperatures, some kind of technology, a furnace of some sort that doesn't just have a fire burning in it, but sort of pushes the boundaries of how much heat you can draw out of any burning substance, right? So it's dangerous. It takes specialized knowledge. And in a way, it could be said that ironworking was kind of like magic, right? Just as hunters and other people who went into the forest, into the wilderness, back to what we talked about last time, were stigmatized. That is, they were admired, but also sort of kept at arm's length, considered to be different from everyone else, considered maybe even to be a little bit strange. And that was true because they were the only ones who ventured into these wilderness areas. The same thing went for iron workers. They were stigmatized. They were seen as strange, as not necessarily like everyone else, right? Iron workers tended to, again, they were admired. They were given special places of honor in the societies, but that also came with a kind of skepticism or even fear about what they were, what kind of powers they wielded, and what role they should have in the society in terms of like political decisions and things. Iron workers tended to marry, their children of iron workers, I should say, tended to marry other children of iron workers. Maybe from the next village over or something like that, because the lore, the understanding of how to do this magical thing was kept within a small circle of people. So it made sense to that their children would end up marrying each other, because the children of iron workers probably also have that stigma with them. You'll see this to some extent, by the way, in The Dark Child, which is takes place in the early 20th century, but still treats the traditional African society. And the main character, Laie, because this is really kind of autobiographical. Laie's father is an iron worker, or he's a metal worker. He doesn't just work in iron; he also works in gold. He is seen as magical, as having special powers, almost like a superhero. But also, there's a sort of stigma to the fascination that people have with him. So remember that when you encounter that book. Now, we've already talked a lot about the culture of West Africa, but let me just underscore some important points here. Again, you'll see these, or you will have seen these in Sundiata. You'll see this to some extent in both Things Fall Apart and The Dark Child. In terms of religion, syncretism was the order of the day. Islam made it into certainly the Sahel region, and probably was known further south, though not necessarily embraced like it was in the Sahel, especially in the major cities like Timbuktu and Djenné that had important mosques and important centers of Islamic education. But syncretism was really the rule everywhere. No matter where we're talking about, there was a mixture of Islam and the indigenous religious forms, beliefs in sort of nature spirits, beliefs in the supernatural that went along with traditional African notions. So whether people were Muslim or, were adherents of an indigenous religious tradition, they did have a variety of deities, but most important for them were ancestors. So there was a hierarchy of deities in West Africa, and this is not the only place we see this. It's really all over sub-Saharan Africa. Tends to be, especially running through, I think, the Niger-Congo language family, that words for deities and ancestors are held in common. They're obviously tremendously important words. The roots are similar, in this whole kind of linguistic situation. In the Igbo tradition, which is, the Igbo people were a kind of non-hegemonic entity that lived in the Niger Delta region, what is now southeastern Nigeria. And actually, this is the language that people in Things Fall Apart. This is Chinua Achebe's language, and so you'll see some of this. There is a conversation between a Christian missionary and an Igbo villager in Umuofia in Things Fall Apart, where they're talking about religion. The English missionary Reverend Brown insists that there is only a single God. This God is he it seems had learned the name of the chief deity in the Igbo tradition, which was Chukwu. And so he says, well, Chukwu is the only, and so he just assumes that's God, right? So Chukwu is God, and there are no other gods. And the fellow from Umuofia shoots back and says, no, Chukwu is the ultimate of all the gods, but he is remote. He's essentially, we don't bother Chukwu because we have all of these other deities. Just as the chief doesn't do everything himself, doesn't make all the decisions himself, and doesn't do all of the important tasks in the village, he has helpers to do that. Chukwu has helpers as well. He has other deities who sort of do his bidding. And we approach those deities first, but when they fail us, then we go to Chukwu. He's the ultimate god. He's kind of the god of last resort, as it were. But even more importantly and more commonly, people venerated their ancestors, even their direct ancestors, even their fathers and mothers and their grandparents who had passed on. In some cases, quite recently, were venerated. Shrines were set up to them. Masking cults. Where the elites of the village would put on masks, were meant to channel the spirits of the ancestors. The masked participants in these rituals would take on the guise of the ancestors, or in some cases, the deities. And so people communed in various ways with the deities and the ancestors. Ancestors had to be appeased, or they would sort of carry out their wrath on the people who had forgotten them, right? Ancestor veneration, ancestor worship is important all over sub-Saharan Africa, has been traditionally from time out of mind. As a result, funerary and burial practices are tremendously important, as are various remembrances of the dead, mementos that people keep, clothing they wear, other things, so that they always feel like they have the ancestor with them. Burial practices or funerary practices often involve massive feasts, celebrations of the life of the recently deceased person. When I lived in Africa, I actually attended a few of these funerals, and it was unbelievable how elaborate they were, how much food people provided. That was one of the things that kind of stunned me. It was incredible to be part of this. I once got dragged into one of these funerals and asked to speak. And I didn't know the person I knew some of the people there, but I didn't actually know the person who was deceased. And so I got into it. I stood up and said a few words, and it was really kind of a cool experience. Everybody said they liked what I said. I didn't really know what I was doing, I think, but cultural experience, right? There's also a strong belief in these traditional West African societies, and in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, in witchcraft and the power of witches. Witches were thought to be individuals who could tap into the evil spirits or the evil supernatural forces, and bring about and cast spells and bring curses. And so things like droughts, famines, accidental deaths, any sort of unfortunate circumstance or natural disaster, a potential witch was an easy target for this. Most often these were women, as witchcraft accusations were in Europe and early colonial America and things like this, but not exclusively women. Men could also be witches or participate in witchcraft, and there was definitely a fine line between the traditional healers and lore keepers and witches, right? Because and perhaps even iron workers, blacksmiths, because they all tapped into these supernatural forces. Now, Islamic reactions to the syncretism, to the worship of multiple deities, to the veneration of ancestors, to beliefs in witchcraft, tended to be fairly condemnatory. They tended not to think that this was okay and tried to eradicate it in the societies where there was a Islamic clerical presence. Same thing after the introduction of Christianity, starting in the really starting in the 15th and 16th centuries, to some extent. Jesuits and even Protestant missionaries are operating in Africa by the late 16th or early 17th century, with Dominicans and others even before that, actually. But they condemned all of these things, but that didn't stop the syncretism from happening, definitely didn't stop partly because the people who were in power were key to the traditional practices, and they didn't necessarily want to let those things go because it was important for their wielding of power. We've talked about the oral traditions already a great deal, so I don't want to belabor this point too much. Here on the left we have a kind of artistic image of a griot. Griots, hopefully you understand by this point, are really important. And there are still griots, by the way, in West Africa. This is a role that is still maintained in traditional societies, and they still keep oral traditions. They still learn these things, memorize stories and pedigrees and sort of lineage charts and all of this, so that they can keep the culture alive. Same thing with proverbs. Proverbs, as you've seen in Sunjata and as you will see again in Things Fall Apart, were vitally important to the culture. This is one of the ways that people made sense of the world, was coming up with wise sayings, often metaphorical in nature, that explained why things were the way they were. There's a real emphasis in the oral traditions on prosperity and harmony, the maintenance of harmony, that influential or good rulers or leaders would bring about prosperity and would bring harmony between peoples, harmony between human beings and nature. That is perhaps the most important theme in the oral traditions. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here because the next slide starts to delve into Eastern and Southern Africa, and I think that there's enough material there that I don't want to push this too long. So I will do another video on that topic, and you'll see some themes there that are common with these traditional West African societies. Again, because there is to some extent, a shared tradition of language and culture that runs all the way through these places that have speak Niger-Congo languages. So look forward to discussing these things with you and hearing your reactions. Thanks.